Now we are moving on to a very important part of this section, and that is called polar curves. So here our main intention is to plot the corresponding relationship, right? And there is a crucial thing that you should realize when it comes to polar curves. Now when it comes to just the normal curves, the usual curves that we used to have in the x and y coordinates, right? Here if you say a certain curve, that means it is a relationship between x and y, right? So here it's kind of a relationship between theta and r, but you have to understand this very correctly, okay? Because now here in the normal Cartesian, when plotting the Cartesian coordinates, you have both x and y because this is the Cartesian plane, right? But when it comes to polar curves, we are plotting it in the polar coordinate system. So there are no x and y axis in the polar coordinate system. So that's the most important thing you should realize when it comes to these polar curves. There are no x and y these x and y lines in the polar curves, right? You just have the polar coordinate system. That means you start from the pole and you have a horizontal, not a, it need not to be a horizontal line, but it's just a line, right? And for our convenience we draw a horizontal line. So this is the kind of the fundamental structure we have when we are plotting the polar curves, right? There are no y-axis or this x-axis in our polar coordinate system. So that's a very important thing that you have to understand, right? And we'll start with a simple example. So now suppose if we are to plot this one, what is the curve represented by polar equation? Now this is a polar equation, right? Now just for a moment, think about the Cartesian system. So in the Cartesian system, if we are supposed to plot, now if this is x and if this is y, and if we are supposed to plot the curve of y equals 2, then it will be a straight line, a horizontal straight line passing through 2, right? This also can be represented as this one as a function of x, and this is the curve for this constant function, right? But here, now that's why I told you not to relate these two fundamental structures, right? Here we are in the polar format, right? So in the polar format, we should go through those that specific nature or the behavior in the polar coordinate axis system, right? So here we start with this straight line. Let's have this as the as a horizontal line, and this is the pole, right? Remember, you can have it for any theta value as long as you have 0 for the r coordinate, right? And here it says the radius. Now before plotting it, what do we exactly mean by a plot? In a plot, it represents the relationship. Now for example, if you go back to this Cartesian system, and if we say, if we are asked to plot this curve, that means we draw a straight line like this passing through the origin. That means if we choose any point in this line, right, now the slope of this straight line is 1, right? Then if we choose any point in this line, then that point will satisfy this equation, that the basic a relationship between this curve and the equation, right? And if we go to another example, let's have this one, y equals x squared. So the plot will take a shape like this. So what do we mean, like what's the relationship between this curve and the equation? If we choose any point in this curve, on this curve, then that the x and the y coordinate of this point will satisfy this equation, right? So that's the relationship between the point, the equation and the curve, right? So the same the same behavior should be there in here as well. That same behavior, when comparing, you should compare with this equation and whatever the curve we draw here, right? So what should be the relationship? Now suppose if we draw a certain curve that goes along with this equation, then that the points on that equation on the curve should satisfy this equation. Now for the Cartesian system, when I say a point, that means that point is represented by the x and y coordinates. So those x and y coordinates should satisfy this one. In here, those x and y coordinates should satisfy this one, right? So here, when I say a point, that is represented by r and theta, right? So the r and theta values should satisfy this equation. Now since in this given equation there is no mention of theta, so the only requirement that we should look for is this relationship. In other words, we have to choose all the points that satisfies this equation. So whatever the point we choose, it should have a radius of 2. Hence, it will be a circle centered at the pole with the radius 2, right? See, if you draw a circle with the radius 2, then for any point on this circle, you will have a radius of 2, and this property is only exhibited for these for the points that lie on the circumference of the circle, right? So if you consider any other point other than the points on the circumference, it does not have this equation, right? So the only possibility that we can have for this equation is the circle centered at the pole with the radius 2, right? So this is very important, and you have to understand it very clearly, right? So the main thing behind this is we are dealing with the different coordinate system. So we are not plotting it in the x and y axis, right? We have the polar axis. So in the polar axis, this is the only thing that we have, right? And in this axis, we are going to draw or to sketch all the points that satisfies the given equation. And I will tell you one more thing to think about. Now suppose if we are going to a Cartesian system where x-axis is represented by theta and y-axis is represented by r, right? So here we have the x and y coordinates, right? Here we have x that is represented by theta and y-axis, and that is represented by r, right? And if we plot this same relationship in this plane, now here we have the Cartesian system, then it will be just a horizontal line passing through 2, right? See, you have the same equation, but a totally different diagram. So that entirely depends on the axis, I mean the coordinate system that we use. Okay, so you must identify these differences very clearly.